At 73 years old, Miriam Coulter had spent her entire adult life being the kind of woman other people described with words like dependable, not ambitious in the way the world tends to reward, not glamorous, just dependable, steady as the seasons. The kind of person who showed up quietly, handled what needed handling, and made sure everyone around her was comfortable, even when she herself was not. She had grown up in Hannibal, Missouri, the youngest daughter of a school teacher, father and a mother who spent 30 years behind the counter of the family hardware store. Her childhood had been modest but full. The kind of upbringing that teaches you the value of hard work and the importance of never making a fuss about your own needs. She carried both lessons with her for the rest of her life, sometimes to her own detriment. She married Edgar Coulter at 24, a quiet, broad-shouldered electrician who loved her with the same steady, unhurried reliability he brought to everything else. Together, they built a modest life in the town of Willow Creek, a rented house on Oak Ridge Road that they filled with furniture from estate sales, a vegetable garden out back, 2 children who grew into decent adults and then moved on to their own distant lives. Edgar died 11 years ago, October 2014. A stroke on a Wednesday morning so sudden and so final that Miriam had not fully believed it until the funeral was over and the house was quiet for the first time in decades. She survived his death by doing what she always did. She kept going. She tended her garden. She paid her rent faithfully every month from her Social Security check and the modest savings Edgar had left behind. She visited her neighbors, attended her church, and settled into a widowhood that was quiet, but not unhappy. She was not a woman who required much. She had everything she needed, or so she believed. The house on Oak Ridge Road had been rented from the same family for 18 years. Since 2007, back when Edgar was still alive, and their son Griffin was finishing college in Oklahoma. The original landlord, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Gentry, had been the kind of man who still believed a handshake meant something. He fixed what broke and gave fair warning before adjusting the rent. He had known Edgar. He had treated Miriam with quiet respect, and she had trusted him without ever needing to say so. She had assumed, without quite putting it into words, that she would simply grow old in that house, that the rent would stay manageable, that Harold Gentry's sense of decency would outlast both of them. She was wrong about that. Harold Gentry died on a Sunday in October 2025, a quiet death in his sleep at 87, the kind of death people call a blessing when they are trying to be kind about the fact that someone is gone. By the following Friday, Miriam had met his nephew. Garrett Whitley was 43 years old, sharp-suited, and had inherited 3 rental properties in Willow Creek, along with an attitude toward them that bore no resemblance to his uncle's. Garrett believed in market rate adjustments and maximum returns. He believed above all that sentiment had no business in real estate, and that an elderly widow paying below market rent in a house he could renovate and sell for a significant profit was not a loyal tenant worth keeping. She was in his calculation an obstacle. He left the eviction notice in the mailbox on a cold Tuesday morning in early November. He did not ring the bell. He did not knock. He simply slid the envelope inside and drove away. 30 days. The language was legal and bloodless, designed to make cruelty feel administrative. Miriam sat at her kitchen table for a long time after reading it. The same table Edgar had hauled in from a neighbor's garage sale 20 years ago. The table where her children had done their homework, where she had paid every bill, drunk every morning coffee, marked every ordinary day of a life she had quietly loved. Her hands did not shake when she read the notice. That came later. In the moment, she felt only a kind of suspended disbelief. The sensation of standing on solid ground and watching it turn to water beneath her feet. 18 years. 18 years of rent paid on time every month without fail. 18 years of quiet reliability the kind landlords were supposed to value. And it had bought her exactly 30 days. She called Griffin first. Her son, 48 years old, now a corporate accountant in Tulsa, with a wife and 2 teenagers, and a mortgage on a house in a subdivision that looked exactly like every other subdivision in America. He was sympathetic in the hurried way of a man already calculating inconvenience. "Mom," he said, his voice careful. "We have the spare room. You know that. It's just Sarah's got her craft stuff in there right now. And the kids. You know how teenagers are. But we can figure something out." She heard his wife's voice in the background, a low murmur that Griffin responded to with a tense, "Yeah, I know." Then back to Miriam. "Let me talk to Sarah. We'll work something out. Okay, just give me a few days." Miriam thanked him. She told him not to worry. She told him she would figure something out. She called Laurel next. Her daughter, 45, a nurse in Cincinnati, who had gone through a difficult divorce 3 years ago and was raising a 10-year-old son in a 2-bedroom apartment while working night shifts at a hospital. Laurel was warmer, more genuinely worried, but also hours away and without room to spare. "Mom," she said. "Oh my God, Mom, what is wrong with people 30 days? That's insane." Miriam could hear the exhaustion in her daughter's voice, the kind of tiredness that comes from working 12-hour shifts and trying to keep a child fed and clothed and happy on a salary that never quite stretches far enough. "I can send you some money," Laurel said. "Not a lot, but maybe enough for a deposit somewhere, and I'll come visit as soon as I can get time off. We'll figure this out together, okay?" Miriam thanked her. She told her she loved her. She told her not to send money she could not afford to send. After she hung up, Miriam sat in the quiet of her kitchen and understood with perfect clarity that she was alone in this. Not because her children did not love her. They did. But because they were living lives that had no space in them for an elderly mother who suddenly needed more than an occasional phone call and a visit at Thanksgiving. She was 73 years old. She had no intention of being anyone's burden. And she was absolutely not done yet. The 30 days moved faster than Miriam expected. She had spent the first week in a kind of suspended disbelief, going through the motions of her daily routine, as though the notice in the mailbox had been some administrative error that would resolve itself quietly if she simply waited. She watered her plants. She baked a loaf of bread. She sat in Edgar's old armchair by the window and watched the November light drain out of the afternoons and told herself she had time to think. By the second week, she understood that she did not. The rental market in Willow Creek was not what it had been when she and Edgar had first moved to Oak Ridge Road. The town had changed incrementally over the years, in the way small Midwestern towns sometimes do. A few new businesses on the main strip, a couple of subdivisions built on what had once been farmland, property values creeping upward in ways that benefited owners and punished everyone else. What Miriam had paid Harold Gentry each month was, she now realized, a number that existed in a different era. The current listings she found at the library computer were almost double that amount, and most of them required first and last month's rent, plus a deposit along with a credit check that Miriam was not at all confident she would pass. She visited 4 apartments in the 3rd week. The first was on the 2nd floor of a building near the highway with a broken elevator, and a landlord who kept referring to her as Grandma, in a tone that was not kind. He walked her through the unit with the air of someone doing her a favor, told her the building was popular, told her she would need to provide proof of income, a credit report, and references from previous landlords. When Miriam asked how much the deposit was, he named a figure that was more than 3 months of her Social Security check. Then he looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "No offense, but at your age, I'm going to need some extra assurance you can keep up with payments." Miriam thanked him and left. The second apartment was available immediately, which should have been her first warning. The previous tenant had left in what appeared to be a significant hurry, judging by the smell and the state of the walls. There were stains on the carpet that Miriam did not want to think too hard about. The bathroom tiles were cracked. The kitchen faucet dripped in a way that suggested it had been dripping for months, maybe years, without anyone caring enough to fix it. The landlord, a man in his 30s who seemed perpetually distracted by his phone, told her the place was a steal at the price. Told her she could move in tomorrow if she had cash. Miriam thanked him and left. The third apartment was clean and manageable. A small 1-bedroom in a quiet complex on the east side of town, with decent lighting and a landlady who seemed genuinely kind. But it required a 6-month upfront commitment. First month, last month, and 4 months of security deposit. Because the landlady explained apologetically, we have to be careful with fixed-income tenants. 6 months up front would have consumed nearly all of Miriam's savings. The money Edgar had left her. The emergency fund she had been carefully preserving for more than a decade. And even if she paid it, she would be left with almost nothing to live on while she figured out what came next. Miriam thanked her and left. The fourth apartment was above a bar on Main Street and would not be available until February, which was, as the landlord explained with genuine helpfulness, technically only 3 months away. 3 months away. Miriam had 30 days. She drove home from each viewing and made herself a cup of tea, and sat with the specific loneliness of a person who is doing the arithmetic and finding that the numbers will not cooperate. She did not tell Griffin about the apartments. She did not tell Laurel. She did not want to hear the worry in their voices, the helpless offers of assistance that would only make all of them feel worse. On the 28th day of November, Miriam sat at Edgar's kitchen table and looked around the house she had called home for 18 years. The table itself, the armchair by the window, the small bookshelf Edgar had built in the corner, the framed photographs on the wall, Griffin's high school graduation, Laurel's wedding back before the divorce, Edgar standing in the backyard garden with a basket of tomatoes, grinning like he had just won the lottery. She looked at all of it and understood that she was out of options. The next morning, she drove to the county assessor's office. It was a low brick building on the edge of downtown, the kind of government office that smelled like old carpet and industrial coffee. Miriam walked up to the front desk and asked the woman behind the plexiglass partition if there were any programs for temporary housing assistance. The woman, who looked about 40 and had the weary patience of someone who answered difficult questions all day, pulled up something on her computer and shook her head. "There's a wait list," she said, "for county assistance. It's running about 4 months right now." 4 months. Miriam had 2 days. She thanked the woman and turned to leave. She was halfway to the door when a voice behind her said, "Ma'am." Miriam stopped, turned. A man in his early 60s was standing near the counter holding a file folder and looking at her with the kind of expression that suggested he had been listening. He had the build of someone who had worked with his hands at some point in his life, though he wore a county badge on a lanyard around his neck now. His name tag read, "Pete Cordova, Assessor's Office, 22 years. He stepped a little closer, lowered his voice slightly. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said. "And I don't want to make any promises, but there's a parcel out on Hickory Ridge Road that the counties had listed for a while. Old storage structure on a 1/4-acre lot. Hasn't sold. I don't think anyone's even inquired in the last year." Miriam looked at him, waited. "How much?" she asked. Pete glanced back at his computer screen, pulled up something, frowned slightly. $5, he said. "Technically just to transfer the deed. Taxes were delinquent for years. County just wants it off the books." Miriam felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but at least the absence of despair. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. Pete was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "It's a shed," he said. "Metal-sided. Been sitting empty for a long time. County almost condemned it twice because of the condition. Roof's probably not great. I wouldn't get your hopes up about the inside." He looked at her directly. "Ma'am, I'm being honest with you. It's not a house. It's barely a storage building. You look like you needed an option. And this is the only one I've got." Miriam held his gaze for a long moment. "Can I see it?" she asked. Pete wrote down the address on a slip of paper and handed it to her. "It's at the end of a gravel track," he said. "You'll know it when you see it. And if you decide you want, come back and we'll do the paperwork." Miriam took the paper, folded it carefully, put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. Pete nodded, said nothing, went back to his desk. Miriam walked out into the cold November morning and got into her car and sat for a moment with the slip of paper in her hand. $5. She started the engine and drove east. Hickory Ridge Road ran out past the old grain co-op and the abandoned drive-in theater that had been a field of weeds for longer than anyone could remember. The gravel track Pete had mentioned was barely visible from the main road, marked only by a rusted county stake and an old no dumping sign that had clearly been ignored at some point in the recent past. Miriam turned onto the track. Her car bounced over ruts and stones. The land on either side was flat and brown dead grass and bare trees, and the kind of emptiness that felt less like peace and more like abandonment. At the end of the track, she saw it. The shed was approximately 20 feet by 14. Metal-sided, though the original color was unknowable beneath layers of rust and oxidation that had turned the entire exterior a deep streaked brown red. The roof was corrugated steel, bowed slightly on one end but still intact. A single small window on the south-facing wall had been covered from the inside with what appeared to be cardboard. The door was padlocked, a detail that struck Miriam as almost funny, as though anyone would want what was inside badly enough to force their way in. On the door itself, faded and peeling but still legible, was an old county notice. Condemned property, it read. Unsafe for occupancy. The date on it was from 6 years ago. Miriam got out of the car, stood in the cold air, and looked at the structure for a long time. This was it. This was what $5 bought. This was what the county wanted off its books. A rusted metal box in the middle of nowhere, condemned twice, with a roof that sagged and a floor that was probably rotted through. She thought about Garrett Whitley's eviction notice, the smirk on his face when she had called him to ask if there had been some mistake. The way he had laughed, actually laughed, as he told her that business was business and she had 30 days to vacate. She thought about Griffin's careful voice on the phone, the spare room, the hesitation, the unspoken calculation of how much disruption an elderly mother would cause. She thought about Laurel's exhaustion, the night shifts, the 10-year-old son, the 2-bedroom apartment that barely had space for the two of them, let alone a third person. She thought about the landlord who had called her grandma in that tone, the apartment that smelled like despair, the 6 months of rent she could not afford. And then she thought about this shed. This $5 shed on a 1/4 acre of Missouri dirt that nobody wanted. It was not a home. It was barely shelter. But it was something. And it was hers. For $5, it could be hers. No landlord. No eviction notice. No one to answer to. Miriam pulled out her phone, called the county office, asked for Pete Cordova. When he answered, she did not waste time. "I'll take it," she said. There was a pause on the other end. "Ma'am," Pete said carefully, "I want to make sure I was clear. It's just a storage structure. It doesn't have utilities. I don't even know if the floor is solid." "I understand," Miriam said. "I'll take it." Another pause, longer this time. "All right," Pete said finally. "Come by the office tomorrow morning. We'll get the paperwork done." Miriam hung up, stood in the cold and looked at the shed, at the rust, at the condemned notice, at the padlock and the sagging roof and the 1/4 acre of dead grass surrounding it. Tomorrow was the 30th day, the last day of her eviction notice. She got back in her car and drove home. The next morning, Miriam arrived at the county office when it opened. Pete Cordova was waiting for her with the transfer deed already printed out. He walked her through the paperwork, had her sign in 3 places, and handed her a copy along with a small brass key on a plain metal ring. The key to the padlock, he said, left over from whoever owned it last. He looked at her for a moment, the way someone looks at another person when they want to say something but are not sure they should. "You got family?" he asked finally. "Someone who can help you out there?" Miriam thought about Griffin in Tulsa, Laurel in Cincinnati, the kitchen table she would be leaving behind, the house on Oak Ridge Road that had been home for 18 years. "I'll be fine," she said. Pete nodded, did not look convinced, but he did not press. "Good luck," he said. Miriam thanked him, took the deed and the key, and walked back out to her car. She spent the rest of the morning packing. Not everything. She could not take everything. Just the essentials: clothes, blankets, a few dishes, the photograph of Edgar from the garden, the small camping cot she had bought years ago for a trip that never happened, a box of cleaning supplies, a folding chair, a portable propane stove. Griffin called while she was loading the car, asked if she had found a place. She told him she had. She did not tell him what kind of place. She did not tell him about the $5 shed, or the condemned notice, or the padlock key in her pocket. He sounded relieved. "That's great, Mom. I'm glad you got it figured out. Listen, Sarah and I were talking, and if you need help with the move or anything, just let us know." "Okay, I'm fine," Miriam said. "I'll call you once I'm settled." She hung up before he could ask more questions. By early afternoon, her car was packed. The trunk, the back seat, every available space filled with the compressed remains of a life that had once taken up an entire house. She walked through the empty rooms one last time, ran her hand along the kitchen counter, stood in the doorway of the bedroom she had shared with Edgar for so many years. Then she closed the door behind her, locked it, left the key in the mailbox the way the eviction notice had instructed, and she drove east on Hickory Ridge Road without looking back. The gravel track was rougher than she remembered. Her car scraped bottom twice before she reached the clearing where the shed sat, waiting in the gray November light. Miriam parked, got out, stood for a moment with the brass key in her hand. She was 73 years old. She had $30 in her wallet, $400 in her checking account, and $11,000 in savings that she had promised herself she would never touch, unless it was an emergency. This she supposed qualified. She walked to the shed door. The padlock was old and stiff with rust, but the key turned. The lock released with a metallic click that sounded too loud in the stillness. Miriam pulled the padlock free, set it on the ground, and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Old wood, cold earth. The particular staleness of enclosed air that has been sitting undisturbed for a long time. And underneath all of that, something else she could not immediately name. Something almost dry and papery, like the inside of an old book. She stepped inside. The interior was dim. The only light came from the door she had left open, and the pale gray sky visible through a crack where the roof met the south wall. She stood still and let her eyes adjust. The floor was wood planking old and visibly soft in places, covered in a thin layer of grit and what looked like decades of dust and debris. The walls were bare metal sheeting on the inside, streaked with oxidation. Several wooden shelves ran along the eastern wall, empty except for a few rusted coffee tins and a coil of wire so corroded it had fused into a solid mass. In the far corner, a wooden workbench sat with its legs slightly uneven, one end propped up by a folded piece of tin. It was not a home. It was barely a storage space. It was cold and dim and smelled of years and neglect, and the specific melancholy of things that have been abandoned without ceremony. Miriam Coulter stood in the middle of it and nodded once, the way you nod when something confirms what you already knew. Then she went back to the car and got her cleaning supplies. The first 3 days were about function, not feeling. She swept. She scrubbed. She pried off the cardboard covering the small window. and let the winter light come through the grimy glass. She patched the gap in the roofline with a tube of weatherproof sealant she bought from the hardware store in town. Standing on the folding chair, because she did not have a ladder, she set up the small camping cot she had brought, positioned it away from the soft spots in the floor, and arranged her essentials with the careful efficiency of someone making a decision to survive rather than to be comfortable. She did not cry. She had already done her crying. What she felt instead was a kind of focused anger that she had learned over the past month to treat as fuel. On the fourth day, December 4th, she decided to address the floor. There was a section near the workbench that had begun to bow dangerously underfoot, soft and spongy in a way that made her nervous every time she walked past it. She did not have money to replace the entire floor, but she could at least remove the worst of the rotted boards before someone, meaning herself, put a foot through and broke an ankle. She had found a crowbar in the back of her car, left over from some long-forgotten home repair project Edgar had started and never finished. She wedged it under the edge of the first soft board and pulled. The wood came up easily, too easily, rotten all the way through. She tossed it aside and reached for the next board. That was when she saw it. Beneath the second board, instead of the packed Missouri dirt, she expected there was a seam. A deliberate seam cut in a rectangle approximately 4 feet by 3, with a recessed iron ring set flush into the wood on one side. A trapdoor. Miriam sat back on her heels and stared at it. She was not an impulsive woman. She thought carefully before she did things. She considered the structural integrity of whatever lay beneath, the possibility of animal habitation, the practical question of what use a hidden underground space could actually be in her current situation. She thought about all of these things for approximately 45 seconds. Then she took hold of the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked, swollen slightly with old moisture, but not sealed. It came up with resistance and then, all at once, releasing another wave of that dry, papery smell she had noticed on the first morning. Stronger now, almost sweet. Below was a root cellar, perhaps 5 feet deep and roughly the same footprint as the trapdoor, with packed earthen walls that had been lined at some point with fitted wooden boards, dry, remarkably dry given everything, and stacked inside it wrapped in what appeared to be muslin cloth tied with cotton cord. Bundle upon bundle reaching from the earthen floor to just below the trapdoor frame were shapes that Miriam recognized even through their wrappings. Quilts, dozens of them, carefully, deliberately stored, preserved as though someone had placed them there with great intention and with every expectation of returning. Miriam reached down and lifted the nearest bundle. Even through the wrapping, she could feel the weight of it, the density of the stitching. Her hands, which had been steady all week, began very slightly to tremble. She did not yet know what she was holding, but something in her, some instinct older than reason, understood that she was holding something that mattered. Miriam carried the bundles up one by one, setting them on the workbench in the thin December light that came through the cleaned window. There were 31 of them. She counted twice to be sure. Each one was wrapped in muslin cloth that had aged to the color of old cream tied with cotton cord that had dried and stiffened but not rotted. Whoever had packed these had done it properly. Whoever had packed these had wanted them to last. She opened the nearest bundle first, working the cord loose with careful fingers pulling back the muslin layer by layer until the quilt inside was revealed. She spread it across the workbench as far as the space allowed and stepped back and looked at it. It stopped her breath. The quilt was large, perhaps full bed size, worked in a pattern she recognized distantly from her mother's descriptions of old craft traditions. A complex medallion design radiating outward from a central octagonal block, pieced from dozens of distinct fabric squares in deep indigo, rust gold, and cream. The stitching was extraordinarily fine, small and even in a way that spoke of both skill and an almost incomprehensible patience. The fabrics themselves were aged but not fragile. The colors had softened with time but not faded to meaninglessness. The whole thing had a presence to it, a density of intention that made the dim metal shed feel briefly like somewhere serious. Miriam had grown up around quilts. Her mother had made them. Her grandmother had made them. She understood enough about the craft to recognize the difference between something assembled for utility and something made with a different order of care altogether. What was on the workbench in front of her belonged to the second category. It belonged, she thought, to a category beyond even that. She opened a second bundle, another quilt equally arresting, a double wedding ring pattern in colors that should not have survived decades underground as well as they had. A third revealed a log cabin design so precisely executed that the geometry of it seemed to generate its own kind of energy. A fourth was a cathedral windows pattern, each tiny folded window piece stitched with a precision that would have required a magnifying glass and a level of commitment Miriam could barely imagine. She sat on her camping cot in the middle of the shed, surrounded by open bundles, and looked at what she had found and tried to think clearly. The obvious question was who had made them. The second question was why they had been hidden here. The third question, the one that began to surface slowly as she handled each one, was what they might actually be worth. Miriam was not naive about antique textiles. She had watched enough of the kind of television programming that featured appraisers in estate sale discoveries to understand that handmade quilts of significant age and quality could command serious prices, particularly in certain markets, particularly when accompanied by any kind of provenance. She also knew she was not an expert, and that what she thought she was seeing and what was actually there might be two very different things. She needed information. She needed someone who knew what she did not. The nearest town with a library that carried reference materials on American folk art and textile history was 40 minutes away. Miriam drove there on the morning of December 10th. The librarian, a precise woman in her late 50s named Cecile Brennan, who wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain and had clearly heard unusual research requests before, helped Miriam locate 3 reference volumes on American quilt history and directed her to an online database of documented antique textile sales. Miriam sat at the library table for 4 hours. She took careful notes in the small spiral notebook she had carried in her purse for years. What she learned rearranged everything. The patterns she had found, the medallion, the double wedding ring, the log cabin, the cathedral windows were consistent with documented styles from the mid to late 19th century. The fabric compositions she could assess by touch and examination suggested pre-industrial weaving. The stitching density in several of the quilts matched what the reference text described as the work of accomplished makers in the Missouri and Kentucky quilting traditions, women whose work had in documented cases sold at major auction houses for figures that made Miriam's notebook hand pause and press harder on the page. A single, authenticated 19th century Missouri quilt of significant quality had sold at a St. Louis estate auction 3 years prior for $4,200. A collection of documented works by a known maker had gone for $46,000. Miriam had 31 quilts in a root cellar on Hickory Ridge Road. She sat in the library parking lot afterward and did not start the car for a long time. The winter afternoon was gray and cold, and the bare trees along the street moved in a wind she could see, but not hear through the glass. She thought about Garrett Whitley's eviction notice in the mailbox. She thought about Griffin's spare room offered in the tone of inconvenience. She thought about the county clerk stamping the transfer deed twice without looking up. $5. She had paid $5 for this. She started the car and drove back toward Hickory Ridge Road. And for the first time in months, she was smiling. The first person Miriam called was Cecile Brennan. It was not the obvious choice. Cecile was a librarian she had met once for 4 hours over reference books and a shared pot of bad coffee from the machine near the periodical section. She was not a friend. Not yet. But she was the only person Miriam had encountered in the past several weeks who had helped without hesitation and without the particular look people gave a 73-year-old woman alone. That careful, slightly pitying expression that meant they were already calculating how much of a problem she was likely to become. Cecile had not looked at her that way. Cecile had looked at her research request the way a person looks at an interesting problem, which is to say with energy rather than reluctance. Miriam called the library the next morning, asked for Cecile by name. And when the librarian came on the line, Miriam explained as plainly as she could what she had found and what she needed. She needed to know how to authenticate antique quilts. She needed to understand the process of having them formally assessed. She needed to know whether what she was holding was genuinely significant, or whether she had spent 4 hours in a library building a tower of hope on a foundation of wishful thinking. Cecile was quiet for a moment after Miriam finished. Then she said, "I know someone you should talk to." The someone was a woman named Dr. Anita Voss, a textile historian at the University of Missouri who had spent 30 years documenting American folk art traditions. She drove down to Willow Creek on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later. December 21st, in a car full of reference binders and a magnifying loupe that she wore around her neck like a piece of jewelry. She was in her mid-60s, brisk and warm in equal measure, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of face that suggested she had spent most of her life looking closely at things other people overlooked. She walked into the shed on Hickory Ridge Road, by then considerably cleaner and more organized than it had been when Miriam first opened the padlock, and stopped in front of the first quilt Miriam had spread across the workbench. She said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Then she said, "Where did you get these?" It was not a question. It was the tone of someone recalibrating. Miriam told her the whole story. The eviction, the $5 deed, the padlock key, the trapdoor beneath the rotted floor. Dr. Voss listened without interrupting her magnifying loupe, already moving slowly across the surface. Stitching of the medallion quilt, and when Miriam finished, she looked up with an expression that was carefully professional, but not quite able to conceal what was underneath it. "This stitching pattern," she said, "is consistent with documented work from the Missouri River Valley tradition. Approximately 1870 to 1890. The fabric composition in this central medallion block This is a pre-commercial dye, almost certainly natural indigo. You don't find natural indigo in quilts made after about 1885 in this region. She moved to the second bundle. May I? Miriam nodded. Dr. Voss opened 4 more quilts over the next hour, examining each with the loop, and with her bare hands turning edges, examining backing seams, holding sections up to the light from the window. She photographed everything. She made notes in a small leather journal. She did not say much while she worked, and Miriam, who had learned when to let silence function, did not fill. When she was done, Dr. Voss sat down on the folding chair Miriam had set up beside the workbench and removed her loop and looked at Miriam directly. I cannot give you a formal appraisal today, she said. That requires documentation, provenance, research, and a certified process I can refer you to. But I can tell you what I believe I am looking at. She paused. I believe several of these quilts are the work of a single maker, or possibly 2 makers working in close collaboration in the Missouri River Valley tradition, dating to the 1870s or 1880s. The consistency of the stitching across multiple pieces is remarkable. The preservation is extraordinary. Whoever stored these understood what they were doing. And the quality of the work itself is, in my professional opinion, exceptional. Not merely good, exceptional. Miriam asked the question she had been holding for 3 weeks. What does exceptional mean in practical terms? Dr. Voss gave her the number carefully, as though handing someone something breakable. Individual pieces in this condition and of this quality, she said, authenticated. And with any provenance, documentation would likely attract serious collector interest. A collection of this size and coherence, if provenance could be established, could draw institutional attention, museums, university collections, historical foundations. She mentioned a range of figures. The lower end of the range made Miriam's hands still in her lap. The upper end made the shed feel like a different place entirely. $150,000 to $300,000. After Dr. Voss left, Miriam sat alone for a long time. The winter light was failing outside. She could hear the wind moving through the dead grass on the lot. She thought about the woman who had made these quilts. Whoever she had been. Working in the lamplight of some long-gone Missouri farmhouse with no idea that 150 years later a 73-year-old widow would pull her life's work up out of the ground and be saved by it. She thought about that woman for a very long time. Then she picked up her notebook and started making a plan. The authentication process took 4 months. Dr. Voss referred Miriam to a certified textile appraiser in Kansas City named Raymond Howell, a man in his late 50s with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent his entire professional life learning to see what others missed. He drove out to Hickory Ridge Road in mid-February with an assistant and spent an entire day photographing, cataloging, and examining each of the 31 quilts with a thoroughness that Miriam found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. The way any process feels unnerving when the outcome matters too much to be casual about. Raymond said little during the examination itself. He communicated primarily through the sounds he made, small involuntary notes of appreciation that he seemed not entirely aware he was producing, soft hums of interest, the occasional sharp intake of breath when he turned over a corner, and found something particularly well executed on the backing. He called Miriam 3 weeks later with his preliminary findings. 23 of the 31 quilts, he told her, were authenticatable as mid to late 19th century American folk textiles of significant quality. Of those, 14 showed sufficient stylistic and technical consistency to suggest the work of a single primary maker. The remaining 8 were likely collaborative works from the same regional tradition. 4 pieces, he said carefully, were in his professional opinion museum grade. The kind of work that serious institutional collections actively sought and rarely found intact. He gave her the formal appraisal figures. Miriam wrote them down in her spiral notebook with the same careful hand she had used to write grocery lists for 40 years. And when she was done, she put the pen down and sat very still in the folding chair beside her workbench and breathed slowly until the feeling in her chest resolved itself into something she could manage. The total appraised value of the collection was $227,500. Miriam was 73 years old, living in a shed on a gravel lot on the edge of a small Missouri town, and she was sitting on a fortune that had been buried beneath her floor. She did not make any sudden decisions. That was not how she was built. Instead, she spent the following weeks doing what she had always done when something important needed thinking through. She worked while she thought. She continued improving the shed, installing a proper wood stove with a flue that Raymond's assistant had helped her source. Replacing the worst of the floor planking with solid oak boards, she sanded and sealed herself, adding a second window on the north wall to improve the light. Her hands had become something she barely recognized, calloused and capable. The hands of someone who built things rather than simply maintained them. Cecile came out on weekends and helped. Their friendship had deepened in the way friendships sometimes do when they begin in practical necessity and discover somewhere in the middle of shared work and honest conversation that they have become something more. Cecile brought food and reference materials and her own particular brand of clear-eyed encouragement that never tipped into false comfort. She was the first person Miriam told about the appraisal figures, and her response, a long silence followed by a very quiet expletive that was entirely out of character, was exactly what the moment called for. The story of what Miriam had found might have remained private, contained to the small circle of people who knew, had it not been for a woman named Gloria Park, a journalist who wrote a weekly column for the regional paper out of Jefferson City, and who had heard about the authenticated quilt collection through Dr. Voss, who had mentioned it in a university newsletter piece about significant folk art discoveries in Missouri. Gloria called Miriam in early March and asked if she would be willing to talk. Miriam thought about it for 2 days before saying yes. The article ran on Thursday, March 12th under the headline, "Evicted at 73, she found a fortune beneath a $5 shed." It told Miriam's story plainly and without embellishment, which turned out to be more than sufficient. The eviction, the deed, the trapdoor, the quilts, the appraisal. Within 48 hours, it had been picked up by 3 regional outlets and 1 national lifestyle publication that ran a condensed version under a different headline that Miriam found slightly overwrought, but did not object to, because the attention it brought was beyond anything she had anticipated. Her phone did not stop ringing for a week. Collectors called. Museum curators called. A documentary filmmaker called twice. Women who had been through their own versions of what she had been through called in the evenings after the professional inquiries had quieted, and those were the calls Miriam stayed on the longest. sometimes talking for an hour to strangers who were not quite strangers, because they were speaking a language she understood completely. It was during the second week after the article that Garrett Whitley appeared on Hickory Ridge Road. Miriam was outside when his car came up the gravel track, a newer model sedan moving slowly, and with a visible uncertainty about whether the track was going to be adequate for its clearance. She was transplanting seedlings into the raised bed she had built along the south wall of the shed, and she did not stand up or move toward him. She waited. He got out of the car looking smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was still the same broad-shouldered man in the same category of expensive coat. But there was something compressed about him, something that suggested the period since November had not been uncomplicated. He looked at the shed, the new window, the repaired roof, the raised garden bed, the neat gravel path Miriam had laid from the track. And his expression moved through several things before settling on something she could not immediately identify. "Mrs. Coulter," he said. "Mr. Whitley," she said. She did not put down her trowel. He told her he had read the article. She said nothing. He told her he had not realized the property had any value when it was transferred to her by the county, that if he had known there was anything of significance there, he would naturally have. And here he paused, recalibrating his sentence mid-construction. And Miriam waited patiently for him to land somewhere. He landed on the word partnership. There was, he explained, potentially a legal question about whether a property sold by the county for back taxes might carry with it certain claims related to the items discovered within it. His understanding was that found property on a purchased lot was a complex area. He had spoken to someone not quite a lawyer. His tone suggested, but adjacent to one who believed there might be grounds for a conversation about shared interest in the collection's value, a percentage, a reasonable arrangement between reasonable people. Miriam set down her trowel then, not because she needed her hands free, but because she wanted to give him her full attention when she said what she was about to say. She told him that the deed to the property had been transferred to her cleanly and legally by the county of Missouri. She told him that she had consulted with an actual lawyer 3 weeks ago, which was the first thing she had done after the article ran and the calls had started, and that the collection was unambiguously hers. She told him that the word partnership was an interesting choice for a man who had communicated with her exclusively through a mailbox slot and had not said a single word to her face in the 18 years she had paid his uncle reliable rent. She told him she wished him well, and she meant it because his misfortune was not something she wanted on her conscience, but that she was done with this conversation. Garrett Whitley stood on Hickory Ridge Road for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he spoke again. "You're going to need to sell them," he said. "The quilts. And I have connections with collectors, auction houses, people who can get you top dollar. No one else in this town has those kinds of contacts." He paused. "Let that settle. What do you think you're going to do? Sell them on the internet. You'll get a fraction of what they're worth. I can help you get the real value. For a reasonable percentage, of course." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was colder than before. "Dr. Voss and Mr. Howell have already introduced me to the right people," she said. "I don't need your connections. And I would like you to leave my property now." Garrett stood there for another 10 seconds, his face doing something between anger and disbelief. Then he got back in his car without another word and drove away. Miriam picked up her trowel and went back to her seedlings, but she understood watching the dust settle on the gravel track that he was not done. Men like Garrett Whitley did not accept defeat gracefully, especially not when they believed something valuable had slipped through their fingers. The attacks, when they came, were subtle. It started in late March. Cecile heard it first from 3 different people over the course of a week. Casual mentions, offhand comments, all with the same basic shape. Had she heard that the expert from Kansas City was re-reviewing the quilts? That there were questions about whether some of them might actually be reproductions? That the whole thing might not be as valuable as people thought? Cecile brought it to Miriam on a Tuesday evening. Sat at the small table Miriam had set up in the corner of the shed and relayed the rumors with the careful precision of someone delivering bad news. Miriam listened, said nothing for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Garrett." Cecile nodded. The rumors served a purpose. They created doubt. And doubt in the world of high-value antiques could be devastating. Collectors were cautious. They wanted certainty. The merest suggestion that something might not be authentic could kill a sale before it began. And then Margaret Whitfield stopped returning calls. Margaret was a private collector in Chicago. Raymond Howell had introduced them in mid-March. She had expressed serious interest in the medallion quilt, had asked detailed technical questions that demonstrated she knew exactly what she was looking at, had indicated she was prepared to make an offer at the appraised value. And then, suddenly silence. Miriam called twice, left voicemails, sent an email. Nothing. On the evening of March 28th, Miriam sat alone in the shed with only the oil lamp burning. The wood stove had gone cold. The 31 quilts were rewrapped and stacked carefully in the corner. She looked at them and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in months. Doubt. What if she had been wrong to trust them? What if Dr. Voss and Raymond had been mistaken? What if Garrett had enough influence, enough connections, enough malice to destroy everything she had built? She sat in the dark and let herself think those thoughts. Let herself feel the weight of them. And then her phone rang. Margaret Whitfield, apologizing profusely for the delay. Work had been insane. She had been traveling. She was so sorry for going silent. And yes, she was still very interested in the medallion quilt. In fact, she would like to drive down the following Tuesday to examine it in person. Miriam felt something release in her chest. Before she could stop herself, she said, "I heard there were rumors about the authentication." Margaret laughed. A short, dry sound. "Mrs. Coulter," she said, "I have been collecting for 30 years. Rumors are the oldest trick in the book. People use them to drive down prices, to create hesitation. I trust Dr. Voss. I trust Raymond Howell. And frankly, if someone is spreading rumors about your collection, it probably means they want it for themselves and can't afford to pay what it's worth." She paused. "I'll see you Tuesday." Miriam hung up, sat in the lamplight, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that she had not lost yet. Margaret Whitfield arrived on Tuesday afternoon, May 7th, exactly when she said she would. She drove a practical sedan that looked like it had seen better days. and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades learning to trust her own judgment about what mattered. She was businesslike and knowledgeable. She examined the medallion quilt for 20 minutes, asking 3 precise technical questions that demonstrated she understood exactly what she was looking at. She did not attempt to negotiate below the appraised value. She did not make small talk or waste time. She wrote the check that afternoon, $8,100. Then, she shook Miriam's hand at the door of the shed and said with what appeared to be genuine feeling that it was one of the finest pieces she had acquired in a decade. Miriam deposited the check the following morning, drove to the bank in town, filled out the deposit slip with careful handwriting, watched the teller process it with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested $8,000 checks were unremarkable in her day. Then Miriam sat in her car in the bank parking lot and did not start the engine for a long time. She had done it. She had actually done it. The first quilt was sold. The money was real. This was not a dream or a mistake or something that would evaporate when she looked at it too closely. This was hers. Over the following months, 9 more quilts found homes. 2 went to private collectors through Raymond Howell's network. Serious buyers who understood what they were purchasing and paid the appraised values without hesitation. $15,400 combined. One went to a folk art gallery in Nashville that mounted a small exhibition around it. They sent Miriam a photograph of the quilt hanging on a white wall, under proper museum lighting framed by an explanatory card that told its story in 3 careful paragraphs: the shed, the trap door, the $5 deed. The gallery paid $6,800. 3 were acquired by the Missouri State Historical Society after a process of negotiation that Dr. Anita Voss helped Miriam navigate. The society understood they were acquiring not just objects, but a documented piece of regional cultural history. They paid above the individual appraised values, $34,200 combined. The remaining 3 sold through an estate auction house in St. Louis that Raymond had recommended. The auction attracted bidders from 6 states and generated a brief flurry of coverage in the kind of publications that covered such things. $28,900 combined. By August, Miriam had sold 10 quilts. The total she had received after auction fees and tax implications she had carefully researched with the help of an accountant Cecile had recommended was $93,400. She made 2 decisions. The first was that she would keep the 4 museum-grade pieces, not for sale at any price, not because she had calculated their maximum value and was waiting for it, but because they belonged to whoever had made them. And since that woman was long gone and could not receive them back, the closest thing to honoring her was keeping them together and intact. The second decision was that she would keep the remaining 10 quilts as well, at least for now. She was not done deciding what to do with them, and she had learned at 73 that patience was not the same thing as delay. What the sales had given her beyond the money itself was foundation, a word she turned over in her mind frequently during those months because it meant what she needed it to mean. Not just financial security, though it was that, but something more structural, a base from which to stand, rather than a constant scramble to stay upright. For the first time since Edgar had died, and arguably for the first time in years before that, Miriam Coulter was not managing scarcity. She was building something. She started with the shed, not because she needed to. She could have rented an apartment now, could have moved somewhere with running water already installed and floors that did not require her personal involvement. But the shed was hers in a way that went beyond the deed in her name. It was the place that had required her full self at the moment when she had almost forgotten she had one. Abandoning it felt like a betrayal of everything the previous months had taught her. She hired a local contractor named Dwayne Morrison, a man in his mid-50s with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life working outdoors, and the quiet competence of someone who did not need to talk about what he knew. Cecile had recommended him, said he did good work and charged fair prices, and did not treat women like they were idiots when they asked technical questions. Miriam and Dwayne worked together for 3 months, July through September. She learned what she could and delegated what she could not. He taught her about insulation techniques and basic wiring and how to fit plumbing connections without creating leaks that would not show up until winter. She did as much of the work herself as was practical, laying the oak flooring, cutting the second window on the north wall, fitting the trapdoor with proper hinges and a new ring pull that would not corrode. She kept the original workbench. She kept the metal structural bones of the building and the corrugated tin roof and the basic geometry of a working structure that had been standing in some form since the 1880s. But she added proper insulation between the metal walls and new interior boards. She added plumbing that connected to a small septic system Dwayne installed at the edge of the property. She added wiring that ran from a junction box he mounted on the exterior wall connected to the county power grid. The root cellar she cleaned and lined with proper shelving for the 14 quilts she was keeping, the 4 museum-grade pieces and the 10 she had not yet decided about. By late September, the shed was finished. It was still recognizably itself. Still a metal building with a tin roof on a gravel lot at the end of Hickory Ridge Road. But it was also unmistakably a home. Miriam placed her mother's kitchen table, the one Edgar had hauled from a neighbor's garage sale in 2005, under the east window where the morning light came through. The oak floor she had laid herself was polished and solid underfoot. The 2 windows let in natural light that made the space feel twice as large as it actually was. This was not the home she had lost. It was something different, something that bore her fingerprints in every detail, something she had made. Griffin and Laurel came to visit in October. Griffin flew in from Tulsa on the 12th. Miriam picked him up at the airport and drove him out to Hickory Ridge Road without explaining much beyond the basics. She wanted him to see it. She wanted him to understand what she had done without her having to translate it into words first. He stood in the doorway of the shed for a long moment when they arrived. Just stood there looking. His expression moved slowly from disbelief to something that looked like pride, though it took him a moment to locate it in himself. "Mom," he said finally, "you built this?" "With help," Miriam said. "But yes." He walked inside, looked around, ran his hand along the oak floor, examined the wood stove in the corner, stood at the window and looked out at the raised garden bed and the gravel path and the 1/4 acre of land that his mother owned outright. "This is incredible," he said quietly. Laurel arrived 2 days later. drove up from Cincinnati with her 10-year-old son in the passenger seat. She walked into the shed and sat down at the kitchen table and cried quietly for a minute. Then she laughed at herself for crying. "I'm sorry," she said. I'm so proud of you, Mom." Miriam made coffee. They sat together in the afternoon light and talked the way they had not talked in years, honestly, without the careful distance that had accumulated between them since Edgar died, without the particular awkwardness of a mother who was supposed to need her children, and children who were not sure how to provide what was needed. Griffin said, "Mom, I should have come sooner. When you first got evicted. I should have." Miriam reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You're here now," she said. Later that evening, Cecile arrived with a bottle of wine and a pan of cornbread still warm from her oven. The four adults sat around Edgar's table, while Laurel's son explored the property outside, with the kind of fearless curiosity that 10-year-old boys bring to unfamiliar places. They ate and talked until the light outside was gone and the Missouri stars were out in full. Miriam looked around at all of it. The quilts hanging on the walls, the oak floor, the windows she had cut herself, the people she loved, and the people she had found. She felt something she recognized finally as joy. Not relief. Not survival. Joy. The distinction mattered enormously. While Miriam had been selling quilts and rebuilding the shed, she had also been pursuing another question. The question of who had made them. It had started as simple curiosity. But the more she handled the quilts, the more she studied them, the more it felt like something she owed. To know whose hands had created this work, whose vision had conceived these patterns, whose life had been compressed into these stitches. She worked with Dr. Anita Voss and a local historian named Thomas Brennan, a retired professor in his early 70s with a patient manner and an encyclopedic knowledge of central Missouri property records. Together, they spent June and July tracing the ownership history of the shed and the quarter-acre lot on Hickory Ridge Road. Backward through the county archives, it was slow work. The records were incomplete in places. Property had changed hands multiple times. Names appeared and disappeared without clear explanation. But Thomas was meticulous, and Dr. Voss knew which questions to ask. And Miriam had learned that patience produced results, that haste did not. In mid-July, they found her. Beulah Crane. The property, according to deed records from 1876, had belonged to a woman named Beulah Crane, a freed black woman who had settled in central Missouri sometime after the Civil War. The records showed she had purchased the quarter-acre parcel outright in 1876 for $23, had farmed it, had lived on it in some kind of structure, though the original building was long gone and replaced at some point with the metal shed that now stood in its place. Beulah Crane had died in 1891. No surviving children were listed. No clear heirs. The property had passed through probate and been sold to settle debts. After that, it had changed hands 6 more times before the county took possession for delinquent taxes in 1998. But there was more. Thomas found references to Beulah Crane in the records of the local historical society. Brief mentions in meeting notes from the 1880s. A woman known in the community for her quilting, whose work was admired, whose skill was recognized even in an era when such recognition for a black woman in rural Missouri would have been far from guaranteed. Miriam sat with the archival records on a quiet evening in mid-July and felt something in her chest that was almost unbearable in its precision. Beulah Crane had made these quilts, had stored them underground in the root cellar, wrapped carefully in muslin, with every intention of returning to them. And she had not returned. She had died. And the property had passed through hands that did not know and did not care what lay beneath the floor. For 130 years the quilts had waited, and now they had ended up in the hands of a woman who understood in a way that felt like the universe aligning with deliberate purpose exactly what it meant to be told that the work you had built with your own hands had no value. Miriam made a decision. The 3 quilts that had gone to the Missouri State Historical Society would be documented under Beulah Crane's name, not as the work of an unknown maker, but as the work of Beulah Crane, freed woman, farmer, quilter, a woman whose skill had been recognized in her own time and whose legacy deserved to be preserved in her own name. Dr. Voss helped Miriam draft the documentation. The Historical Society accepted it without hesitation. And in late August, Miriam received a letter from the curator thanking her for the contribution and informing her that the quilts were now on permanent display with full attribution to their maker. Miriam kept that letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in the wooden box where she kept the deed to her property and the photograph of Edgar in the garden and the other documents that marked the most important moments of her life. In early November, Cecile organized an event at the Willow Creek Community Center, a gathering for women over 60 who were navigating transitions, divorce, widowhood, displacement. The particular invisibility that seemed to descend on women past a certain age, like a weather system nobody had warned them about. Cecile had asked Miriam if she would be willing to speak, to tell her story. Miriam had hesitated at first. She was not a public speaker. She did not think of herself as someone with wisdom to impart. But Cecile had looked at her with that clear-eyed directness that Miriam had come to trust, and said, "You don't have to give advice. Just tell them what happened. Let them decide what it means." So Miriam had said yes. 43 women came. Some of them drove more than an hour. They sat in folding chairs with coffee cups in their hands, and the careful expressions of people who were hoping to hear something true. Miriam stood at the front of the room and told them the truth. She told them about the eviction notice in the mailbox on that cold Tuesday morning in November, about Garrett Whitley's laugh as he drove away, about the 4 apartments that were not possible, and the conversation with Pete Cordova at the county office that lasted less than 5 minutes and changed everything. She told them about the padlock key and the smell of old paper and the trapdoor and the 31 bundles wrapped in muslin that had been waiting underground for longer than she had been alive. She told them about the appraisal figures and the newspaper article, and Garrett coming back to the gravel track with his talk of partnerships and percentages. She told them about building a floor and cutting a window and learning at 73 that her hands were capable of things she had never asked them to do before. And she told them about Beulah Crane, because that was part of the story too. That the shed and the land had once belonged to a freed black woman who had settled in central Missouri after the Civil War, who had farmed a 1/4 acre and made quilts of a quality that her community recognized and admired. who had died in 1891, leaving no direct heirs and a property that had passed through a succession of owners, none of whom had known what treasure lay beneath the floor. Beulah Crane had stored her life's work underground, Miriam said, wrapped it carefully, with every intention of returning to it. She did not return, but the work waited. 130 years underground. And it ended up in the hands of a woman who understood in a way that felt almost unbearable in its precision, exactly what it meant to be told that what you had built with your own hands had no value. The 3 quilts now at the Missouri State Historical Society are documented under Beulah Crane's name, Miriam said, because that is whose work they are, and she deserves to be remembered. She paused, looked around the room. A portion of every sale from the collection went into a small fund I established with Cecile's help, she said. Emergency housing assistance for older women in our county, because the specific terror of having nowhere to go is something I do not want another woman to navigate alone if I can help it. I am 75 years old. I live in a shed I built myself, and I have never been more awake in my life. The room was quiet when she finished. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people waiting for something to end, but the full quiet of people sitting with something that had landed in them and needed a moment before they could respond. Then a woman in the 3rd row, probably in her late 60s, wearing a coat that had been carefully mended at both elbows, started to applaud. The rest of the room followed, and it went on for long enough that Miriam had to look at the ceiling for a moment to keep herself composed. Afterward, women lined up to speak with her. They told her their own stories in low voices, quickly, the way people tell things they have not told often enough to have found the right words for yet. A woman whose husband had left after 41 years of marriage. A woman whose landlord had tripled her rent. A woman who had been told by her own children that she was too old to start anything new. A woman who had driven 80 minutes because she had read the newspaper article 6 months ago and cut it out and kept it in her kitchen drawer, and had finally worked up the courage to come. Miriam listened to every one of them. She did not offer easy comfort or the kind of cheerful reassurance that would have dissolved the moment they got back in their cars. She told them what she actually believed, that the worst thing that had happened to her had turned out to reveal everything she actually was, that the shed had not made her. It had found her. The person required to do what she had done had always been there, waiting under the ordinary surface of a life lived in someone else's house, on someone else's terms, needing only to be given no other option. She told them not to wait for an eviction notice to find out who they were, but also not to make themselves small, in the hope that smallness would be rewarded with safety, because it would not be. And because they were worth more than the version of themselves that fit inside someone else's idea of what they should be. Miriam drove home to Hickory Ridge Road in the late evening with the windows down despite the October cold. The Missouri air moved through the car, and the stars were beginning to appear above the flat, dark fields on either side of the road. She turned onto the gravel track and her headlights swept across the shed. Her home, her floor, her windows, her walls. She sat in the car for a moment after she parked the engine ticking as it cooled and just looked at it. She thought about Beulah Crane working by lamplight 150 years ago, stitching something extraordinary into being with no guarantee that anyone would ever see it. She thought about Edgar hauling the kitchen table from a neighbor's garage, not knowing it would outlast him by more than a decade and travel to a gravel lot in the county and become the center of something neither of them could have imagined. She thought about Garrett Whitley's eviction notice and the $5 deed and the padlock key worn smooth on the bow, and the moment the trapdoor had come up, and the smell of old paper and patience had risen out of the dark. She thought about what it meant to be thrown away, and to discover in the process of surviving it that you were not what had been thrown away, that what had been thrown away was the cage, that you yourself were still entirely intact, always had been, waiting for exactly this particular darkness to make you visible. Miriam Coulter got out of her car, walked up the gravel path she had laid stone by stone, opened the door of the home she had built with her own hands. She stepped inside, put the kettle on, sat at her mother's table in the warm light of the place that was hers, entirely hers, made from nothing by someone who had been told she was nothing, and she was more alive and more herself at 75 than she had ever been at 35 or 55, or in any of the decades when she had believed that the life she was living was the only life available to her. She had been wrong about that. Wonderfully, completely, irreversibly wrong. And from that particular kind of wrongness, everything had been built. Miriam sat at the kitchen table with her cup of tea and looked through the window she had cut herself at the Missouri darkness outside. She did not fear it. She had been inside that darkness. She had found the light, and the light had not been given to her. She had built it, stone by stone, board by board, window by window, with hands people had said were too old, by a woman people had said was done. She had never been done. She was only beginning. The quilts hung on the walls around her. Beulah Crane's work and her own life intertwined now in ways that neither of them could have foreseen. Two women separated by 130 years. Both told their work had no value. Both refusing to believe it. Outside, the November wind moved through the grass. The stars turned overhead in their ancient patterns. And inside the shed on Hickory Ridge Road, in the warm light of a home built from $5 and a trapdoor, and the absolute refusal to disappear quietly, Miriam Coulter sat and breathed, and knew with the certainty that comes only after you have walked through the fire and come out the other side, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because anyone had given her permission, but because she had given it to herself.